You're listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
Without further ado, I want to bring back an old friend of the program, James Phillips, who's a Senior Research Fellow for Middle Eastern Affairs with the Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign and National Security Policy at the Heritage Foundation. And Jim, it's great to have you back with John and Brett. And there's certainly no shortage of topics for us to discuss in this particular region.
Oh, it's too busy in the Middle East right now.
Yeah, I think it's actually surprising. I'm shocked, to be honest with you, the level of extremism, we're all aware of in the many different factions that are spread out within the region, and also if you include North Africa or other parts of Africa as well. But when you see the rise of ISIS and what they've been able to accomplish in Iraq and spreading into some of the other areas, simultaneously when you add that to the list of what's happening right now in Gaza, and then now you see, on a minimal basis, but now you're seeing rockets coming from Lebanon into the Golan Heights, and it's only a matter of time of what is this going to escalate further? What is the United States going to do in response to at least what's happening with ISIS?
Well, that's a good question, because the Obama administration seems to be in no hurry at all to decide what it's going to do. Part of that is a strategy to put pressure on Iraqi Prime Minister Maliki to step down in favor of some other leader who would be more capable of uniting Iraqis and forging a national consensus against this new caliphate. But part of it is the administration really doesn't want to get involved militarily at all, and it's trying to do the minimal amount it has to do to help Iraq repel this advance by ISIS.
I think one of the major problems, and this has been occurring throughout this administration, is forget all the foreign policy blunders. But at this point, we have what should be, and I would still hope is an ally in Israel, but it's hard to tell, at least with the administration, going through what they're dealing with on a daily basis, as you see, anywhere from, say 50 to 100 or 200 rockets being launched into all parts of Israel at this point. But then you have the interesting or almost lack of relationship that we all of a sudden have with the Saudis, who have, like a lot of the things that they've backed or been a part of over history, they were very important for our foreign policy. That's a major problem. We've ignored Syria, which is now spilling over and causing problems in parts of Turkey. Probably now Jordan is going to have a major issue. We've seen it spill into Iraq and other places. And as you say, this president doesn't seem willing to commit the military, but at some point, if you can't stand up for what you've really started, because we went into Afghanistan and we went into Iraq, we can't just pretend like we don't have anything to do there now. I'm really at a loss.
Yeah, I think the administration really has bungled not only what's the Iraq situation, but the civil war in Syria. And I think the fact that the administration turned its back on the moderate rebels within the wide coalition that rose up to oppose the Assad regime, the fact that the administration did not provide effective support to those rebels meant that the more radical elements rose in power and were able to dominate, and that helped them move into Iraq. And there, as part of the problem is, as you mentioned, the Saudis got fed up in part because of the administration's Syria policy, when it threatened to bomb and then turned the matter over to the U.S. Congress and then decided not to do anything. That was one of the last straws for the Saudis, and I think they've been bankrolling the Sunni Arab tribes, which have risen up in support of ISIS and amplified the strength of that very small group to the point where it could take large chunks of Sunni Arab territory in Iraq. And I think in the future, if the caliphate is going to be, or the so-called caliphate is going to be defeated in Iraq, it would mean working with the Saudis to split the Sunni Arab tribes from the more radical Islamist extremists that threaten not only Iraqis and the United States, but also Saudi Arabia.
I agree. That last statement that you made is incredibly important, because I don't think that can be accomplished without the helps of somebody who's there, like the Saudis, who could help us distinguish between one from another. Now, when I look at this region over the last, obviously a bunch of years, but particularly the last 2 years or 3 years, as we've seen Syria just completely fall apart, it seems the power vacuum, as this president has been willing to leave, is being filled by Russia, China, and of course Iran's been there the whole time. But I think Iran hasn't gained tremendously here. And I know John has a handful of questions to bring up as we continue this discussion as far as the negotiations there. But what kind of influence do we see right now in Iraq from Iran? And is it, because we see the reporting, but how much truth is it to what we see being reported?
Well, I think, unfortunately, Iran is one of the big winners of what's going on in Iraq, because the Shia-dominated Maliki regime has been greatly weakened, which makes it more dependent on Tehran. And as long as Iraq is locked in sectarian conflict, it's unable to emerge as a stable democracy. And that is Iran's biggest worry, because if the predominantly Shia Iraq can function as a democracy, then many Iranians would be asking why Iran couldn't be a real democracy and not this charade of a democracy that it has now. And one little-known aspect of Iraq is that the Shia holy sites are there in Najaf and Kabbalah, and also the highest-ranking Ayatollah in the Shia sect is in Iraq. He outranks all of the Iranian Ayatollahs, and he rejects Ayatollah Khomeini's radical brand of Shia revolution, and that fact makes a stable Iraq a very dangerous thing for the legitimacy of Iran's Ayatollahs. And that's why I would argue that the Obama administration is crazy to think that Iran is going to be an effective partner in helping to stabilize Iraq, because Iran doesn't want a stable Iraq, because that would be a threat to the ideological underpinnings of the theological regime in Iran.
Jim, that's actually a brilliant statement. I want to throw a couple of pieces together. There's a question here that I'll throw out now, but we'll come back to that, which is I want to get your solution, your suggested solutions, and I want to talk about three different key regional players here: Iran, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. First, this is a very complex interrelated puzzle. Let's make that clear. It is not, we give Obama a lot of grief because we have very little respect for the way he's handled this, but we also understand that even with the best president, it would still be a challenge. That being said, I think we have transitioned from a time period where we propped up, and we partnered with a lot of pretty evil people who didn't even have our interest in mind, like the House of Saud over many years, because stability was in our best interest. And they were the keepers of stability. We are now transitioning, or have transitioned, to a period where the forces at power are the destabilizers. And I think that's the game that Russia is playing, that Iran is, to some degree, you can argue even China behind the scenes is playing. So here's a question I have for you. With that in mind, we really need to stabilize the situation. So first, let's talk about Iran. Iran has a very simple mentality. The mullahs are saying, hell no, and I'm speaking in the context of our current negotiations, whereas John Kerry is saying, oh, please, please, pretty please, can't you please work with us? And, oh, by the way, it'd be nice if you would maybe not sell those arms to your terrorist friends in Gaza that are attacking Israel. So what message does that send to the leaders of Iran? And is there even a hope in the near future, with another 2.5 years of this presidency, for America to redirect that equation to where we're feared and respected?
Well, I think the administration from the beginning really misunderstood the Iranian regime, and one of the first interviews the president gave was to a Middle Eastern Arab television network, Al Arabiya, in which he reached out to Iran, and he repeated that in his first inaugural speech about if the Iranian regime, he didn't mention it specifically, but it was clear he was speaking to Tehran. He said, if they unclench their fists, then we would reach out our hands. And I think they failed to understand that the regime in Iran, for ideological reasons, doesn't want better relations with the U.S. or the West. They want Western technology and trade, Western dollars for their oil, but they don't want close relations because that, the Ayatollahs fear, would lead to a soft revolution, which they endlessly talk about, such as the revolutions that overthrew a lot of the Eastern European regimes after the Soviet Union broke up. And that's the model they've always seen. And so even if they could sign a perfect nuclear agreement, they wouldn't want better relations with the U.S. because the Great Satan has been a keystone of their ideology, and they'd have to explain to their people why for more than 3 decades they were rejecting any better relations with the U.S., and now they suddenly pivoted. So I don't think they're going to be, there's any way to tame that revolution, especially if you do it from a position of weakness like the administration is doing it, by making it clear that they want a nuclear deal more than the Iranians do, and make it clear that, they're seeking Iranian help in Iraq, and next we'll be hearing about Iranian help in Afghanistan, and that really undermines our leverage against Iran.
It does, Jim. In a culture that only respects strength and tenacity, it'd rather you punch them in the face and just be a man. To come in with a weak hand is actually, they're going to be far less inclined to ever negotiate with you because they won't respect you from day one. We had a Green Revolution, and the Green Revolution was the force of moderation in Iran to the point you were making. And quite frankly, our president threw both ends of the rope to him, which was really a shame. I want to turn this back to the House of Saud, because Saudi Arabia, it's such a strange time. Let's compare Qatar and Saudi Arabia. Qatar is essentially the radical Islamist checkbook around the world, and we treat them as very dear friends. Certainly Al Gore does. The House of Saud, who has been an ally but has also been an enemy in their politics and funding madrasas and things for the years, the House of Saud seems to have woken up and seems to be moderating. And at the very time they appear to be moderating, are we not basically spitting in their eye and almost and turning toward Iran, who will never be our friend, at least under this administration? So do you agree with that premise, and do you have any suggestions for how we should be treating the Saudi Arabians versus how we are?
Well, I think you're right that the Riyadh is paranoid that the U.S. is going to strike a deal with Iran at their expense. They think that the nuclear negotiations are the thin edge of the wedge that will lead to better U.S.-Iran relations, and that they would their strategic interests would be sacrificed. And I think the part of the problem with this administration is that it's so focused on a domestic audience that it really shortchanges allies and friends. And I would consider, Saudi Arabia not quite an ally, and maybe a little less than a friend, because it's been in denial about its support of Islamist extremism for so long. But I think that once Al-Qaeda turned on it back in 2003, it did take some steps to cut back on the Islamic Charities funding of Al-Qaeda and other organizations. And in the Arab Spring, it has woken up to the fact that it's created a lot of Islamist extremists in other countries that are working against Saudi national interests. So I have hope that it will continue to go in that direction, and I wish the administration would put more pressure on Qatar to stop its support of groups, especially in Syria and Iraq, that are very anti-Western, anti-American.
Well, it'd be nice if we can only dream. Final quick question for me before I turn you back over to Brett. So 500 rockets rained down on Israel before Obama managed to put down his golf clubs, pick up the phone, and call Bibi Netanyahu our best ally in the Middle East. What if you're Bibi Netanyahu, and then you couple that with John Kerry, who at best gives you a half-baked, we feel bad for you, please don't do too much in response, and continue to live next door to people building weapons and determined to destroy you, raining down on even your nuclear power plant. So if you're Bibi Netanyahu, what do you take away from this message, and how do you deal with the administration? Do you just politely ignore them, or do you overtly countermand them?
Well, I think Prime Minister Netanyahu wants to be sure that when the war ends, that Hamas is clearly in a worse position than when it started, and that would help deter another outbreak of this type of fighting, which this is the third time since 2008 that Hamas has done this. And I don't think that Prime Minister Netanyahu can afford to ignore the U.S., but I think he won't be so enthusiastic about quickly winding down this war because he's more concerned about deterring the next war than just ending this war. And I think the administration, at least now, realizes there's no prospect of a ceasefire in the immediate future. So, it's offered in principle to help negotiate one, but it knows full well that Hamas is the one that's dragging its feet on a ceasefire. So the administration isn't pushing Israel as strongly as it might on this, and I think Prime Minister Netanyahu needs that latitude to try to organize an ending to this war that is in Israel's interests and not just Hamas's.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think when you look at what's happening in Gaza, that, from a common sense standpoint, it's not in the interest of either party, but unfortunately we find ourselves in a situation where Hamas is neither willing to get rid of their missiles or stop launching them every day, and Israel can't not defend themselves. And I think it's telling. There's an obvious rise in escalation in protest and anti-Semitic statements around the world, but I think that there's less support for Hamas right now than there was in the past. Just seeing the various publications from Europe or from the Middle East, even, I think they're statements, but they're muted.
Yeah.
And I just want to make a quick comment, just to go back to something that you and John had discussed earlier. If we allow Iran to obtain a nuclear weapon, a bomb, continue furthering their program, Saudi Arabia is going to have no choice but to have their own program. And I think we're going to see an arms race and a nuclear escalation of the Middle East. And I'd like a comment, if you can, on that.
Sure. I think this is one of the most dangerous aspects of the Iranian nuclear program, that, even if you assume that Iran wouldn't build a nuclear weapon and or use it once it has it, or pass it on to one of its terrorist groups to use against Israel or some other target, even if you make all those assumptions, the inconvenient truth is that once Iran gets it, then Saudi Arabia is going to want one, and the Saudis finance the Pakistani nuclear program, and it's believed that they would have the wherewithal to either buy or rent a Pakistani nuclear weapon and perhaps marry it up with their Chinese ballistic missiles, which are capable of hitting Iran. And then once Saudis have one, then Turkey, Egypt, Algeria, and at some point even Iraq might want one, and you would end up with this multilateral nuclear Middle East in which almost all the countries have a very primitive offensive nuclear capability, but no second strike capability. So there would be a premium on launching on warning, because if you don't use it, you'd lose it, and that would lead to an extremely unstable Middle East with many itchy trigger fingers, and that is a very dangerous thing to happen around the Persian Gulf, which has more than half of the world's oil reserves.
And God forbid someone like ISIS or Al-Qaeda or the Taliban get a hold of one. Jim Phillips, thank you so much for joining us today. I know you spent a lot of time, but there's so much that we covered. If you could please share the website so our listeners could follow Heritage, but also some of the things that you're working on.
The website's at heritage.org, and you can select different issues. There's an Arab-Israeli webpage, a general Middle East webpage, and there's a page for most of the countries in the Middle East.
Excellent. Again, thank you so much, Jim. It's a pleasure to speak with you again.
Thank you.
All right, take care. Jim Phillips, Senior Research Fellow with the Heritage Foundation. Great stuff as always.